Hey everyone, welcome to part two of our lecture introducing the concept of global economics, global political economy, and we're focusing in on neoliberalism and flexibility this week. We're interested in the idea that's being developed in our chapter for this week by Spike Peterson on the emergence of a kind of a global political economy that records certain things and forgets about other things, and has a certain understanding of the market that it's keen to see preserved. So in this part two, having in the last part tracked a little bit of the history of how capitalism emerged, and then looked at some of the difficulties that capitalism has had, especially in the last 100 years or so, with two world wars, the Great Depression, the growth period after World War II of about 30 years, even though taxes were relatively high, and then in the 70s, of course, with the Nixon shocks, the debt that America incurred as a result of the Vietnam War, and the basic collapse of the so-called Bretton Woods institutions, specifically the numeraire, the gold standard, which had been set up by America after World War II as a way to prevent the difficulties of the Great Recession, the Great Depression that had happened in the late 20s. No one wanted to see that again, having basically believed that the decade of the 30s and the economic depression of the 30s was basically what led to World War II in the first place. Because, of course, as many people will argue, the difficulty with something like an economic collapse is that it can lead people to extreme ideologies, and of course that's where maybe they suggest anyway that's maybe where Nazism came from. That's why it became so attractive to people, their economic desperation. So if the 1970s were the turning point where suddenly radical free market ideologies suddenly became acceptable to people and seemed to be the way forward, we need to understand what these ideologies were, where they came from, and why they were desirable. So we use the term neoliberalism today as a general catch-all phrase to cover this emergence of a popular ideology that the markets are the way forward. And there's a lot of different types of neoliberalism, but for the purposes of this lecture, we're referring to the American brand of neoliberalism that emerges in the 1970s, otherwise sometimes called by people sort of market fundamentalism is another word that sometimes gets used, but neoliberalism is generally the basic term that people use to describe free market ideology. So what is neoliberalism? Well, it's a theory which argues that decisions about production and allocation of resources ought to be left to the market and not to government. And as we've already been arguing in the previous section, that's potentially a misleading definition, because in fact, even in a free market system, there has to be some government, and the government is deeply involved, as we've seen in the current financial crisis. If we look at Cyprus, if we look at Italy, Greece, Spain, Ireland, and even in the United States, you see just how eager the government is to get involved on behalf of the major participants in the market to bail out, for example, large banks. If you are someone who believes that every time the government gets involved that somehow is socialism, then you need to be able to come up with an explanation of why the government would get involved to save large banks. How can it be socialism if the government is bailing out the richest people on the planet for their risks, for their mistakes that they've made in their investment decisions? Many people who are more, shall we say, critical of the way government and market interactions take place suggest that in fact that's the opposite of socialism, or rather, if you wanted to put it in specific terms, and we'll be looking more at this next week, it's it's socialism for the rich. Because, of course, in the financial crisis of 2008 and since, there's been no bailout for the people who lost out on their mortgages. There's been a lot of dispossessions. There's been a lot of people getting turfed out of their homes, repossessed homes. So it's not entirely clear that it's fair or realistic or appropriate to suggest that every time the government gets involved, that's somehow socialism. In fact, interestingly, I was listening to Bill O'Reilly there being interviewed the other day, and him basically saying that he thought that the reason why the financial crisis in Europe is so bad right now is that it's basically bad among countries that have kind of nanny states, as he calls them, more socialistic types of states like Italy, Greece, Spain, Cyprus. In fact, he's absolutely wrong on that. The most socialistic state in Europe and the most socialistic states in Europe are the ones that can afford to be socialistic, and that's Germany and that's France. And maybe Sweden and places like that as well. These are countries that are not experiencing financial crises right now. These are countries that actually have very, very buoyant financial markets. So, the thing about the European crisis right now, from an American point of view, people just say the crisis is in Europe. But actually, if you got to look close, because the crisis isn't just in Europe. It's specifically in Mediterranean countries and peripheral countries. It's not in core countries. The core European economies are way more socialistic than the peripheral countries because they can afford it. And in those countries, there's no financial crisis at all. So it's just something to keep in mind. We'll probably get more into detail about this as we proceed next week. But back to neoliberalism, just some of the assumptions that sort of apply in neoliberalism. One of the things that the Nixon shock really sort of made people aware of was just how much debt the nation states had. And as a result of this, because of this debt, that people basically said that the policies that the Keynesians had been pursuing were inflationary, and we know that from our last section last hour that we were talking about the stagflation that had happened, the stagflation that was taking place. Sorry, I just turned that off for a minute. The blame for this, of course, went on the Keynesian style policy preferences that had created the Bretton Woods system in the first place. So in retaliation, or as a response to the Keynesian sort of collapse, the free market theorists were able to step in places like Chile, in places like Britain, in places like the United States, and start to argue that the markets were a far superior solution, that you should just let the markets do their thing. And of course, I guess history is short-sighted sometimes, because in a way, those were the policies that had led to the outcomes that had brought about the Great Depression in the first place. So in a way, we were setting up conditions again to fail, but that's not what people were arguing at the time. And in fact, the great financial crash that neoliberalism was capable of producing, it seems now in retrospect, didn't really happen for about 30 years or 40 years even, because neoliberalism became popular in the 70s, and here we are 30, 40 years later, and finally we're experiencing it. But the theory of neoliberalism is an elegant theory, I suppose. It's the idea that free trade benefits everyone if nation states will just open their borders and allow everything to trade. That there should be free movement of labor and goods and all these different things. And within that, nation states should pursue strategies of what we call comparative advantage. That is to say, if you're better at making butter and I'm better at making guns, well, you specialize in making the butter, I'll specialize in making the guns, and each then will be made for the cheapest price possible because of the efficiencies that are gained by specializing in what you're good in. And then we can trade those cheap goods, very efficiently produced goods with each other. You get the cheapest guns possible, I get the cheapest butter, and everyone's happy, right? And so that's the theory of comparative advantage that makes globalization such a seductive theory from the perspective of neoliberals. And then another thing is that even though the market sometimes will be rewarding people disproportionately, those who are successful in their risk-taking will, of course, reap huge rewards. That's not to say that not everyone will benefit tremendously. As John McCain used to say in his campaign speech in 2008, when he was campaigning against President Obama, he talked about growing the pie. Global economic growth, American economic growth is not a zero-sum game. My win is not your loss. If I can grow my wealth, I will hire more people. And will invest more money back into the production process. And so what John McCain was arguing there is that the pie, the overall wealth in the economy, grows when my wealth grows. And everyone benefits. Not everyone benefits the same, to be sure. My share will grow again as the overall share of the economy grows. But your share will grow as well, because you will be having more jobs and more prosperity, even just relatively to my own. So we have an argument put forward by neoliberals that the markets are more moral because they have this way of rewarding those people who work hard, who take risks, and who are industrious. And on the other hand, then we have this argument that markets are more efficient because they do what they respond to the different types of demand that exists in the marketplace for different types of goods and services. And so through that, we say they create efficiencies. The government, of course, has a tendency, if we look at the Soviet model especially, we see that, you could buy anything you want that was available this week, but you couldn't necessarily buy the things you needed. And that was the major complaint people had about the Soviet model. And so I think that's something to definitely commend the arguments, the logic of markets. But I think in the same breath, we should notice as well that markets and capitalism are not necessarily the same concept. And there is a difficulty in capitalism, I think, just because the Soviet Union was an utter catastrophe, and it was, doesn't necessarily mean that capitalism is the only way you can run a marketplace. There's other types of ways to organize the market as well, where you can get the efficiencies of the marketplace, but you can temper the extremes of the market to create financial crises such as the ones we're having now, or extreme differentials in growth between the rich and the poor, that kind of thing. So neoliberalism, we have to keep in mind, keeps reminding us that it's either or, right? That it's either the government's way or the market's way. But many people are suggesting that there must be some kind of balance between the two, and that you don't have to be a communist or a radical free market advocate in order to come up with a sound theory of economic government. And so that's something we need to keep in mind, I think, as we're moving forward here today. So let's talk about neoliberalism in the United States of America and try to bring in some of the points that we've been developing here in terms of the idea, or the argument rather, that there must be some sort of happy medium between the two different types of extremes. Neoliberalism has not done well in the United States by the people, at least, that is to say. The popular myth of the American economy is that the United States is the most equal country in the world with the greatest political and economic opportunity. And this is the sort of Horatio Alger myth, which we'll be talking about in just a minute. But against this Horatio Alger myth, we have this quote here in the inset box. The claim that the United States enjoys the world's highest standard of living must be evaluated against the equally valid claim that the United States enjoys the greatest absolute inequality between the rich and the poor among developed countries. So what Brandolini and Smeating are putting forward here, and this is a quotation from the comic chapter for next week, actually, is that, while many Americans do believe that there is this wonderful opportunity in America, if you just work hard, you can get ahead. That's a tricky claim to make in the face of the fact that the United States has huge wealth inequality between the rich and the poor. And in fact, if you do want to make the argument that everybody can get ahead if they just work hard in America, then how do you theorize the fact that there are so many poor people, and that they are in fact so poor that it's very, very hard for them to get out of the poverty trap that they are in? Because, of course, as you may know, or as you may imagine, once you're poor, it's very, very hard to get ahead, right? You have educational difficulties, you have difficulties getting the type of things on your resume that you need. You have difficulty even presenting yourself at work, buying a nice suit, buying some nice shoes. All these things become very, very difficult. And oftentimes you're trying to wrestle the needs to get a job against the fact that you're trying to raise a family. So the pressures that people experience when they're poor, quite apart from the stigma of being poor, which is real in America, because if you look at the television, all the people that appear on television in the sitcoms and whatever, they're all quite wealthy. We have this fantasy of the middle class existence that continues to exist, and the middle class lifestyle that continues to exist, but the people on the sitcoms on television who appear to be middle class never really seem to worry about the things that middle class people worry about today in the real world, which is like credit card debt, school loans, healthcare debt. This is definitely the era of debt. Americans have the highest percentage of personal debt in the developed world. More and more Americans are trying to sustain the middle class lifestyle on the back of being in debt. And you might say, well, that's just irresponsible of them. But remember that with the introduction of neoliberalism in the 1970s, middle class salaries have been decreasing. And so that's the subject we turn to now. We want to talk about, for example, Thomas Frank's concept of Richistan, which is something in America that's come into existence since the 1970s, where the gap between the rich and the poor has been widening, and real incomes for Americans has been declining for most Americans since the 1970s in real terms. So let's just look at some of the claims here that are set out in the comic chapter vis-a-vis Thomas Frank's Richistan. He argues that in the United States, the top 1% of American earners take in 21.2% of the income. That's 1% of people earning 1/5 of the income. And so keep that in mind as we look at the next figure. The average U.S. income is $46,806. However, if you take off the top 10% of income earners in the United States, you see that is basically almost halved. Just close to halved. So 90% of Americans earn, once you've taken off that top 10% of earners, earn just $28,980. That's almost $20,000 difference, which is huge, That's definitely over 2/5 of a difference in the total figures there. So how do we explain that, this huge disproportionate wealth between the top and the bottom, where we look at the top 10% of earners and they're coming in with close to $100,000 as an average income. There's a huge gap then between the average income and the top income, and we know that the average income for the bottom 90% is even lower. So most Americans in their lifetimes will not earn more than $28,000 or $29,000. In fact, we can break that down into more specific numbers. But we must ask the question as to whether neoliberalism really works in America, whether this radical free market solution works. Many Americans think that Obama has tried to reintroduce socialist policies and this kind of thing, but in fact, that's not really true. Taxes are still incredibly low in America. Obama has not increased the tax rate at all. Taxes were higher in America under Ronald Reagan. So really, it's sort of a strange thing to argue. Was Reagan a socialist? Absolutely not. So we need to be realistic when we make these kinds of arguments and these kinds of claims. Just some other facts from the comic chapter that sort of speak to this question as to whether neoliberalism works for Americans. Men earn 50% more than women in 1999, so clearly men are winning over women. Hispanic Americans average $31,000. That's out of the total percentage of the pie. That's not just the bottom 90%, that's the full 100%, and then Hispanics earn $31,000. Black Americans earn $34,000. White Americans earn $46,000, which is very close to average, and Asian Americans earn $47,000, which is just over the average. And interestingly, so obviously race is a predictor, but what's more interesting is that actually race is merely a correlated variable. It's not actually the determining variable, because if you want to know what actually controls the amount of money you will earn in your lifetime, it's much more likely to be education. So the reality is that Asian Americans spend a lot more time in school. Hispanic Americans don't spend as long in school. Black Americans don't spend as long in school. But where those categories of people do spend more time in school, they too also earn a lot more than their average peers. So The question then is, where's all this going, right? Why are people who are not educated staying poor? Well, because education really is the key metric to giving you an opportunity in the marketplace. Um, I think the thing to keep in mind, however, is that in an age where funding for schools, for public schools, is being cut, poor people are finding it harder and harder to get the educational opportunities they need to get their average income higher. And so, coincidentally, this tends to affect people from racial minorities more than it affects white people. The white Americans tend to be the ones that have greater access to educational resources. So there's a kind of a chicken and egg scenario here, but it seems that education is the key determining variable. And as Paul Kamek argues on page 305, the United States has a rising Gini coefficient. And what is that? That is a measure of inequality. So what that tells us is that where all this is going is that it's getting worse, right? The situation is not improving. Neoliberalism continues to be a variable in the way United States government is, the United States economy rather, is run. And it's going to continue to be that way for the time being, it seems. Now, let's ask this question on the world scale. If neoliberalism is not doing that well for Americans, how's it doing for the people of the world? And you can see here in what we call the champagne glass, a representation of world population arranged by income, with the top fifth richest people bringing in 82.7% of the total world income. So, what does that mean to us? That means that even though you or I might be considering ourselves middle class, lower middle class, relative to the world economy, we're actually doing very, very well. Even the poorest Americans are still better off than many people in the rest of the world. Although, of course, it's always relative. And so this is the problem with poverty, isn't it? Right? You say, well, you guys have a place to live, you have clothes, you have food, you have a microwave. You can afford some money to buy beer every week out of your welfare check. So why should I care for you? Why would you have a legitimate complaint that you're poor? And of course, really, because in the Western world, poverty is a stigma, right? It's the way people look at you, it's the way you're regarded, and it's the kind of opportunities you have to get a job because of the way you speak or the accent that you have. So, or even the way you're dressed, or even the educational opportunities you've had. A lot of people are going to be sort of prejudiced against you just the minute you open your mouth or the minute you walk in the door. There's a lot of prejudice in America, as we've said before, because of the stigma of being poor. The way television shows represent middle class Americans are falling over themselves to maintain the pretense of a middle class existence, even though they fall into debt in order to achieve that existence. And then, of course, in 2008 financial crisis, those people end up realizing that they've gone too far into debt, and then, of course, the banks were very happy to lend to them when times were good. That's what we call predatory lending, and we'll get into that next week. But nevertheless, we find ourselves here now today in the midst of a very serious debt crisis. But back to globalization. Is the world situation stagnant? No, there is movement in the world situation. The so-called BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, have been showing some serious improvement and have been catching up. They represent the movement of about 1 billion people plus, from some of the lowest performing economic zones to being, as we would say on a global basis, more middle class. But even in these BRIC countries, if we look at their Gini coefficients, we used that term already, countries like Brazil, especially if we look on page 305, do have very broad internal gap between the rich and the poor, quite wide indeed. I mean, some of the richest people in the world live in Brazil, and also some of the poorest people in the world. So when we say they have a shocking Gini coefficient, that means that the gap between the rich and the poor is very wide. So our point, therefore, is that the average incomes of countries might be converging, but That's not to say the average incomes of their inhabitants are converging. They might actually be diverging. So we definitely have to keep that in mind as we think about neoliberalism and the way it's treated the process of globalization. So now let's go back to Spike Peterson. As I mentioned in the last hour, we're going to be doing some jumping around this week and next week because of the way the chapters are structured. And I was talking about Kamek a minute ago, and now I'm going back to talking about Spike Peterson, whose point really is about the impact of flexibilization on the global workforce. As Spike Peterson reminds us, we live in a global economic age where neoliberalism says the market is the supreme power and we must respect and obey the logic of the market at all times. But it's hard to measure what this means for us all, really. If the market really only measures what it can see, how should we say, legally, there's a lot of economic activity that happens in the world that's not measured in the formal market. And this is something that's very important for us to consider because it's testimony to the fact that, as Spike Peterson argues, even though many capitalists and neoliberals argue that the market and the government are opposed to each other, in fact, we see, especially at times of financial crisis, that capitalist markets do depend on the political power states in order to regulate the market, in order to keep the market functioning. In fact, in order to maintain standards in the market such that economic activity in the market can be measured in the first place. That's all very, very important and would not be possible without the power of the nation state. So this leads us to a point that if the state cannot see every type of economic activity, then how much activity is going on in the economy that's not within the constraints of the formal state-sanctioned marketplace? Spike Peterson's point is that, in fact, if we look closely, we can see that 50% of all the activity on the planet is, in fact, informal, that it's not measured by the nation state at all. So it doesn't show up in the numbers. It doesn't show up in the employment index. It doesn't show up in GDP figures. It doesn't show up in Gini coefficients. So there's a lot going on in the marketplace. And some of this is not savory at all. For example, sex trade, white slavery, that kind of thing. All of these would be considered criminal activities, and they, of course, are not measured because the people carrying them out go to great trouble to make sure that they're not seen by the nation state. So that sort of thing would be very, very hard to regulate. Some countries have tried, of course. Obviously, prostitution is legal to a certain extent in countries like Holland. And obviously there's a way in which that would show up on the economic figures for that country. But broadly speaking, prostitution is under the table, so to speak, and it's not measured at all. But Spike Peterson is more interested in what she calls socially necessary labor, and that's the labor of social reproduction. It's the labor of housewives, for example. It's the labor of people who are engaging in type of, shall we say, illegal, maybe, or off-the-books nanny work. Immigrant laborers, for example, taking care of people's children or serving as house servants or are in ways that are off the books. All of that would be considered informal labor, and that's what she's trying to zero in here in this chapter. Now, in neoliberal globalization, a lot of people have been forced out of the formal market into the informal market because of the way that contracts have become so precarious. This has really driven a lot of people to sort of look for job security that wasn't there before, or extra income that wasn't there before, because contracts have become so casual. People in the regular marketplace can be hired and fired so casually. So feminization then is one key point here. Casual contracts is another. Flexibilization is another. We're talking about, oftentimes, when we say feminization, of course, what we're talking about is domestic or socially necessary labor, as Spike Peterson calls it. So we have people doing women's work, i.e. housework, housewife work, child care work. We've got people moving into these types of skills and areas because of the unreliability of contracts and the the sort of precarity that people are experiencing in the regular workforce, and the fact that women, of course, have in many instances got some flexible hours that they can work here and there between maybe the type of work that they would be doing at home. So we can characterize the type of labor that feminization and flexibilization is producing. It's a low skill labor. It's docile. It's reliable. It's available for part-time work, and it accepts low wages. And as a result of that, if we want to sort of address some facts in terms of what this actually means for real life people. Generally what it means is that women are earning 30 to 50% less than men on a worldwide basis. Now, interestingly, economics doesn't really study much of this, and so the costs of this kind of work in terms of people's health, in terms of their incomes, aren't really measured. Where economics tries to measure it or takes notice of it, they tend to say that it's an entrepreneurial choice that just coincidentally happens not to be measured by the official figures. But that's not necessarily fair to say it's somehow an entrepreneurial choice or an individual choice. These populations are among the more vulnerable. They're women, they're migrants, they're the urban poor, and they're quite easily pushed around by the economy. They don't have a foot on the ladder to play the neoliberal game or succeed at it like other people do who have educations, for example. So we know that people in these types of situations are struggling against falling incomes, and they're struggling to make ends meet. So these are people that are in our lives, by the way. These are people who are doing work in the area. They are migrant laborers. They are working on housing projects. They are working on building roads. They're doing a lot of things to get by in a low-wage economy. But they are, as we were arguing a minute ago, a relatively new phenomena in the numbers that they present to us anyway, because of the advent of neoliberalism. Because, of course, prior to that, people had longer-term contracts. There were more unions, and the unions fought very strongly for longer-term contracts. And, of course, there was more money going around. There was more money for social services. In a more indebted America, where neoliberal ideology runs the show, those services are increasingly less available, and people have to go off the books to make ends meet.